had just wrapped up a successful business trip and looked forward to heading home. However, my next flight wasn't for another few hours, so I had a long layover at the newly opened terminal of Maplewood International Airport. It was the latest addition to the city's expanding transportation network, known for its sleek, modern design with high ceilings, polished floors, and futuristic lighting. The kind of place that was supposed to be buzzing with energy. But as I walked through the terminal, I felt an odd unease settling in. The place felt strangely empty. The usual airport noise, people chatting, the announcements over the loudspeakers, was absent. Instead, the terminal was eerily quiet, the only sound being the occasional click of my shoes on the polished floor. Most of the shops were closed, their brightly colored signs dark and lifeless. The overhead lights flickered at random intervals, casting odd shadows along the walls. It felt as though something wasn't quite right, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion from my long journey. Heading toward my gate, I passed a group of security staff whispering in hushed tones. I caught a snippet of their conversation, something about a passenger who had disappeared without a trace, and no one could remember seeing them board the plane. The words lingered in my mind, but I dismissed them as just airport rumors. Or so I hoped. As I settled into my seat at the gate, I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. It was late, and the terminal was almost deserted. The few other passengers around me seemed equally as tired, their faces blank and lost in their own thoughts. But the silence around me only grew thicker, suffocating, as the minutes passed. It wasn't the usual hum of a bustling airport. This felt off. I glanced around, my eyes catching shadows in the corners of the terminal. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on me, but something about the way the shadows moved made me uncomfortable. I turned my attention back to my phone, trying to distract myself with some work, when I heard it. Soft footsteps. Too soft to be real. I looked up. No one was walking past me. In fact, I was the only one sitting near my gate. The footsteps continued, echoing louder now, but the space around me remained empty. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was nothing more than my imagination. Still, I couldn't ignore the sudden drop in temperature that made me shiver. I tugged my jacket tighter around me and stood up, making my way to the restrooms to wash my face and clear my head. That's when I heard it. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me!" I spun around, but the terminal remained as empty as ever. Was it the wind, or was something more sinister at play? My nerves were on edge now. The whispers were becoming louder, more frequent and unmistakable. I could no longer dismiss them as my imagination. As I walked through the empty corridors of the terminal, I felt as if something or someone was watching me. My footsteps echoed through the hollow space, but the sounds of the whispers and faint movements behind me didn't seem to match my own. I quickened my pace, turning a corner sharply, and stumbled upon a small, forgotten office tucked away behind an old security checkpoint. Inside, the room smelled musty, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Dust covered the furniture, and a faded journal lay on the desk. Curious, I picked it up, flipping through its yellowed pages. The journal belonged to a previous airport employee, someone who had worked here long before the terminal had been renovated. As I read, I discovered disturbing entries that described strange disappearances in the terminal, passengers vanishing without a trace, their names never showing up in any records. The journal spoke of ghostly figures, trapped spirits from the old hospital that had once stood on the site, their restless souls haunting the airport, causing them to disappear. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, and my heart skipped a beat. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move. Fast, unnatural. I wasn't alone anymore. Panic surged through me as the shadow darted across the room, vanishing before my eyes. I backed up, my breath shallow, the journal still, clutched tightly in my hand. The whispering grew louder now, surrounding me, each voice more desperate than the last. "Help us!" they begged, their voices rising in unison. My mind raced. I remembered something from the journal. There was a way to break the curse, a ritual that involved acknowledging the trapped souls and giving them a voice. I quickly skimmed through the pages, reading aloud the names written in the journal, names of those who had disappeared, their faces never seen again. As I spoke, the temperature dropped drastically and the lights flickered violently. The floor beneath me seemed to tremble. Suddenly, the terminal began to shake. The shadows faded, the whispers died down, and a heavy silence filled the air. I ran for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors opened, and I stumbled outside into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The next morning, I learned that the terminal had been abandoned years ago. I had escaped, but I knew some things never truly leave. I had always been a frequent flyer, accustomed to the bustling atmosphere of airports, but today was different. I was on my way to an important meeting, and although I was no stranger to airports, something about this one seemed to stand out. The Maplewood International Airport had recently completed a massive expansion, and I was eager to experience the newly built terminal. As I stepped off the escalator and into the gleaming hall, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the new and old parts of the airport. The new section gleamed with modern design, polished marble floors, high-tech displays, and a shiny new gate that stood out like a jewel amidst the rest of the more classic old-world terminal. The airport's vintage charm still lingered in the older gates and waiting areas, but the new gate looked almost out of place, too perfect, too clean, as though it hadn't quite settled into the airport's pulse yet. I felt a spark of intrigue. As my flight was called, I quickly gathered my things, eager to get going. Unaware of the unsettling history hidden within the terminal's walls, I walked toward the new gate, my steps echoing in the quiet terminal. But as I passed through, a strange chill seemed to seep into the air. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the excitement of my upcoming trip. As I entered the new gate area, I noticed the temperature drop. At first, I thought it was just the air conditioning, but it wasn't just cool. It was unnervingly cold. My breath fogged slightly as I walked toward the boarding area, looking around for any sign of movement. The gate, as sleek and modern as it was, felt strangely empty, despite a few other passengers milling around. The area was silent, save for the distant murmur of announcements overhead and the soft hum of overhead lights flickering faintly. I decided to sit down and check my phone, trying to shake off the eerie sensation creeping up my spine. But the silence began to feel heavier, more oppressive. I looked up at the other passengers. They were all staring at the gate, their faces pale, their eyes wide. No one was moving. I noticed the unusual stillness of the air. There were no sounds of rolling luggage, no chatter or laughter, nothing but the soft flickering lights and the echo of my heartbeat. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping. It started at the far end of the gate, the sound of footsteps that didn't quite match the rhythm of walking. As my eyes darted toward the source, the footsteps seemed to grow louder, but when I looked, no one was there. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood up, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, and turned toward the nearby employee desk. I needed to ask someone if they felt it too. But as I walked, the temperature dropped even further. Something wasn't right. As I approached the employee desk, the cold air grew so intense that I could see my breath mist in the air. I shivered uncontrollably. But it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling of being watched as if invisible eyes were following my every move. I glanced back at the gate, the strange tapping sound still echoing faintly, now growing louder and more frantic. The employee behind the desk, a young man named Jason, looked up as I approached. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously to the gate before quickly looking back at me. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered, his voice low and shaky. My stomach tightened. "What's happening here? What is that sound?" Jason hesitated for a moment before speaking. This gate, it was built over the old one. The original gate here was where a man disappeared years ago. Henry Langston. He was a passenger who was supposed to board a flight, but something happened. He walked through the gate and no one ever saw him again. His body was never found, and the authorities said he must have been lost in transit. But the truth is, we think his spirit never left. My heart raced as I listened. The tapping sound grew louder, now almost deafening. "And you think his ghost is here?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jason nodded. "That's not all. We've been hearing strange things, footsteps, whispers, and cold spots. This gate, it's where he died, and it's bringing him back." Before I could ask anything more, the lights above flickered violently, and the temperature plummeted. A shadowy figure appeared in front of the gate. I froze in place, eyes wide in terror. The ghostly image of Henry Langston stared at me, his empty eyes pleading for something I couldn't understand. The air around me seemed to freeze, and the shadow of Henry Langston loomed over me, his form flickering in and out of existence. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Everything around me felt trapped in a moment of intense fear. The whispers grew louder, circling me, urging me to help. Jason, looking more frightened than ever, stepped forward, his voice shaky but determined. "There's a way to set him free. We have to acknowledge him, let him know his story isn't forgotten." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stand firm despite the bone-chilling cold. I turned toward the ghostly figure and spoke softly. "I know your story, Henry. I know what happened to you. You're not lost, and your pain is not forgotten." The ghost flickered once more, his form shifting. The whispering voices grew quieter, and the coldness slowly lifted. With one last sorrowful glance, the ghost of Henry Langston vanished into the air. The lights flickered one last time before returning to normal. I felt a warmth return to the terminal, as if the curse had finally been lifted. I turned to Jason, who nodded with a look of relief. The gate was silent now, finally at peace. I'm a seasoned airport security officer, and I've seen it all. Angry passengers, delayed flights, lost luggage, but nothing prepared me for Flight 666. The old Boeing aircraft had been scheduled for departure multiple times before, yet, for some reason, it never actually left the ground. Tonight it was finally set to take off. As I patrolled the terminal, I noticed something unsettling. The air near Gate 13, where Flight 666 was boarding, felt strangely heavy. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the tiled floor. The passengers waiting for the flight looked off. Some sat stiffly in their seats, eyes glazed over as if in a trance. A woman clutched her boarding pass so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her lips silently mouthing words I couldn't. Here a nervous flight attendant, pale-faced and jittery, hurried past me. I caught a snippet of her conversation with a coworker. "They say this flight never reaches its destination," she whispered. I frowned. That was impossible. I pulled out my phone and checked the airport records. Flight 666 had no past arrival. Records. My pulse quickened. That made no sense. How could a flight exist, and if it had never landed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling gnawing at me. Something about Flight 666 felt wrong. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, I watched the last few passengers walk toward the gate. A man in a dark coat stopped just before stepping onto the jet bridge, looking around as if lost. His face was oddly blurred in the dim light. I blinked and the man was gone. Shivers ran down my spine. Inside the plane, passengers were already complaining. A woman rang her call button, her voice trembling. "Someone is sitting next to me. she said to the flight attendant. But there's no one there. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell checked his instruments. Everything seemed fine, until a sudden static-filled whisper crackled through his headset. "Don't take off." He yanked the headset off, breathing heavily. Was it a radio interference? Or something else? Back in the terminal, I got a call from the control room. "Something weird is going on with Flight 666, the dispatcher said. "The passenger list doesn't match. We have names of people who don't exist." My heart pounded. I turned back to the plane, watching as the doors sealed shut. A deep, suffocating silence fell over the gate. The jet bridge retracted, and then, without warning, the entire plane seemed to flicker like a glitch in reality. For a split second, I swore I saw something horrifying. Charred bodies, twisted metal, smoke-filled air, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. What had I just seen? For a brief moment, Flight 6666 didn't look like a functioning aircraft. It looked like a wreck. A burned, twisted husk of metal. Inside the control room, air traffic controllers were panicking. The plane's transponder signal was flickering in and out, disappearing from radar for seconds at a time before reappearing. That shouldn't be possible. I rushed to an old airport record database, frantically searching for any information on Flight 666. What I found made my blood run cold. Decades ago, a flight with the same number, Flight 666, had crashed during takeoff due to an engine failure. All passengers and crew perished. The wreckage had been recovered, but something was never quite right about the case. Rumors spread among veteran staff that the flight was still trying to complete its doomed journey. My hands trembled as I called, the control tower. "You have to ground that flight, right now," but it was too late. From the window I saw Flight 666 rolling down the runway. The engines roared, the wheels lifted off the ground, and then, in midair, the plane vanished. No explosion, no debris, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. Silence filled the control room. I stood frozen, staring at the empty runway where Flight 666 had just been. No one spoke. No alarms sounded. It was as if the plane had never existed. But I knew what I saw. Frantically, I checked the radar, but there was nothing. No signal, no distress call. The flight had simply disappeared. A panicked voice crackled over the radio. "Tower, this is Gate 13. The flight is still showing on the schedule. It says departing soon, but there's no plane here." My stomach twisted. I rushed to the gate monitors. There it was, Flight 666, scheduled for takeoff in 1 hour, the same flight, at the same time. Again. My hands trembled as I flipped through the old reports. It always happened like this. The flight would depart, disappear, and then reappear on the schedule, waiting to board once more. A never-ending cycle. As I turned, a chill ran through me. Passengers were already gathering near Gate 13. They clutched their boarding passes, their faces vacant, eyes unfocused. And then I saw him, the man in the dark coat from earlier, standing perfectly still. He smiled. I stepped back. The boarding. Announcement echoed through the terminal. "Final call for Flight 666. I stepped off Flight 317, rolling my suitcase behind me. It was well past midnight, and the airport was eerily silent. I sighed, glancing at my phone. My connecting flight was delayed until morning. "Great," I muttered, rubbing my tired eyes. The terminal was almost empty, apart from a handful of other stranded passengers. No staff, no bustling crowds, just flickering overhead lights and the low hum of vending machines. The departure board blinked strangely, stuck at midnight. Made my way to the lounge area, hoping to grab a coffee. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The shops were dark and closed, though the signs outside read, "Open 24/7. The chairs in the waiting area were dusty, like no one had sat in them for ages. Frowning, I walked toward the exit to check, the main terminal, but when I stepped in front of the automatic doors, nothing happened. The sensors didn't respond. I waved my hand. Nothing. I turned to a nearby security desk, but it was completely abandoned. The monitors were static, the phones dead. A chill crawled up my spine. Something was very wrong with this airport. I wasn't the only one who noticed something was wrong. The RALs. Other stranded passengers, about 10 of us, began muttering in confusion. A man in a business suit banged on a locked service door, demanding to be let out. A college student shook her phone, groaning, "No signal, not even Wi-Fi." I glanced at the departure screen. It still blinked at midnight. No flight updates, no staff, no announcements. Then the first person disappeared. A woman in a red coat walked into the restroom, her heels clicking against the tiles. A few minutes passed. Someone else went in, then came back out, confused. "She's not in there," he said. Another passenger, an older man, wandered to a vending machine. "Damn thing stuck," he muttered, tapping the glass. I turned, away for a second. When I looked back, the man was gone. Panic spread. People started running to different exits, pounding on the glass, and yelling for security. That's when I saw him, an old janitor, hunched over, mopping the floor like nothing was wrong. "You ain't getting out," the janitor muttered without looking up. I stepped closer. "What do you mean?" The janitor sighed. "This airport?" He shook his head. "It doesn't let people leave after midnight. Planes land, but they never take off. And the people?" He finally looked up, his eyes dark with something unspoken. "They just disappear." My heart raced. I couldn't let myself believe it, but the janitor's words echoed in my mind. "You won't leave. None of you will." The group, now down to just 6 passengers, made our way through the terminal searching for an escape. The janitor, despite his eerie warnings, had pointed us toward a maintenance tunnel hidden behind a janitor's closet. He muttered something about the tunnel leading to a back exit, but he didn't offer much hope. As we ran, the halls grew colder, the air heavier. The once bustling airport was now an empty maze. Suddenly, I stopped. There, standing near a boarded-up window, were shadowy figures. People from past flights dressed in outdated clothes. Their faces were pale and empty, eyes hollow. They shuffled, aimlessly, their mouths barely moving. "Help us," one whispered, but the words were soft like a haunting echo. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as the figures slowly turned toward us. I swallowed hard. "We need to move," I urged, pulling the group forward. We reached the maintenance door, but just as we were about to open it, a sharp noise echoed through the terminal. A scream cut through the air. I turned. One of the passengers had disappeared into the darkness. He and another passenger reached the door, but the others were gone. We stumbled through the maintenance door, our feet finally hitting the cold night air. We paused for a moment, looking around. But something felt off. The sky above us was a strange, dark hue. No stars, no moon, just a thick, oppressive fog hanging in the air. The distant hum of the airport's lights never seemed to stop. We both turned back to the terminal. It looked unchanged. as though it hadn't moved an inch since we'd stepped inside. My throat tightened. I glanced at my watch. The time read midnight. "This can't be right," the other passenger murmured, but I knew it was true. We hadn't escaped. We had just walked into a new part of the trap. Back in the terminal, a new flight landed, its wheels screeching as it came to a stop. A fresh group of passengers stepped off, oblivious to the horrible truth that awaited them. They were the next to be trapped forever.